This conference will now be recorded.
Hi, welcome again to another video conference learning series from Region 8 Education Service Center. My name is Josh Wenning. I'm the Executive Director with Region 8. Joining me today is my colleague, Cindy McKinney, and we will both we're both excited to hear from Chris Riley today, presenting on the topic of creating blended and e-learning with relationships. And that's really a key part of this new normal that we're in with our instructional delivery, of how do we continue to engage our students from a relational aspect while also trying to give them high quality instruction in a blended and e-learning situation. Today's session, as most of these sessions have been, are brought to us thanks to the support of the Schwab Foundation. Without their generous support of this initiative, these would not be possible. I want to thank them as we start off our time today. Also want to make you aware of a repository of resources that you can find other webinars, information, resources through our Makerspace initiative, and that website is on your screen right now. It's at indianamakerspace.weebly.com, and there will also be some additional resources on the Region 8 website at r8esc.k12.in.us. So to get us started today, we want to welcome Chris Riley to our session. And Chris, welcome, and we're excited to hear from you and learn more about what you have found in your research, and to help us better understand the importance of relationships in blended and e-learning environments. Chris, welcome.
Thank you, and I'm so glad that you're joining us to participate in this webinar. And I hope you find it beneficial and be able to use this information as you proceed forward during this very unusual time in our lives as teachers and educators. As we've been thinking about the upcoming school year and what it would be like before it even ended last year, we were already trying to anticipate. And so hopefully this webinar will help you prepare for this upcoming year, and perhaps even what's going to happen in future years, because it seems highly likely that we're never going to go back, or at least not in any kind of immediate future, to where things were and what we considered normal before. So I continue to work with educators, and right now I've mostly been listening. I've been listening to teachers, I've been listening to students and parents and paras and spec ed teachers, and just trying to gather some information and then digest their thinking and comments and bring a lot of that to you with research that I've done. So I hope this helps you as you work over the summer and begin to prepare for whatever back to school is and whatever that's going to entail for you. We know for sure there are going to be changes, and we also know that no matter what, you all are going to be on the front line making it happen, just like you've been. So we need to be thinking about what students need and what's going to happen as we anticipate how learning is going to continue. So I've titled every slide mostly with relationships rule, because I want to bring everything back to that. So the first thing I thought as I listened to teachers and other educators is creating an updated philosophy, creating a concise and precise philosophy of teaching for these different teaching times that provides essential learning opportunities and builds relationships. Because we're still emerging into an adapted educational process with COVID, and it's dramatically altered and accelerated our use of integrating tech as a key component of these educational processes. We had to race to get online and make adaptations if we had access, and for those of you that didn't, then you had to work with feeling how's this going to work if I'm not face to face, and perhaps you provided things for students to take home, and that may still be your situation. So what might have been our educational priorities as teachers in the past may now need some revision and become simpler. Teachers I've talked to over the past 4 months have indicated that this has been a really important step for them, this thinking about their philosophy, and to determine exactly what is essential as their time with students is so limited. We were in crisis management and crisis mode, and many of us were not particularly experienced or skilled in managing some kind of distance education. So what we may need to think about now is not just this coming year, but again, what a post-coronavirus school world will be like. There's probably going to be a greater emphasis on ed tech and digital learning. And even as we may get to return to physical school and face-to-face time, this still will probably play a bigger part. So likely now, from what I'm hearing and what educators think is going to happen, at best, it's going to be some kind of blend of face-to-face and then some kind of distant learning. So today, what I'd like to do is address this as a technology-based digital education, but these thoughts and ideas are no less key to a blended situation that includes face-to-face and what I call pickup learning, where your students have to come and get stuff and assignments from you when they can't be delivered through that FaceTime digital contact. So I'll address these things, and again, feel free to contact me and ask questions. I'm happy to work with you outside of this webinar. And the other thing I suggest too here as we're getting started is that you create a place, a folder, if you will, or like a live binder situation, if you don't have that on your learning management system, where your stakeholders can access information that we're going to talk about and that you might think is important to post. So in thinking about creating an updated philosophy and thinking about being a teacher, our thinking is, what is my philosophy of teaching now that teaching has changed? How will this philosophy include building relationships with my stakeholders? How will this philosophy create essential learning opportunities? So again, we started out with baptism by fire, and we started dealing with COVID and the resulting shutdown of schools, and we didn't know if and when we might return to the classroom or if we'd even see our students again, let alone did we have time to think about what's our philosophy. We were just putting out fires and trying to figure out what to do. And so when we were faced with this crisis, we just really didn't have the opportunity to recall. We were just getting through each day and trying to meet our kids' educational and sometimes other needs like food and other kinds of things that they needed. So as we're thinking about going through and updating our philosophy, we need to be sure it's pragmatic and useful, and it needs to bring clarity to our teaching decisions. And so some other key decisions we might think about is, how can I simplify my philosophy to fit the current teaching situation I'm in? Is my philosophy understandable to others? If I'm going to share it in some way with my stakeholders, can they understand what I'm saying? And even most importantly is, what attitudes are crucial, what concepts are crucial, and what needs of my students are crucial. So as we continue to think even more, our bottom line thinking is, who's going to own our learning? And that should show up in your philosophy and your teaching decisions. What can be taught with current capabilities? What makes sense given my teaching situation? What makes sense given possible changes throughout the year? We all know we don't know what's coming. We could end up in another shutdown and there's no blended time if that's how we start. And then how can I, as an educator, be creative and ingenious and still hold true to my philosophy? So bottom line thinking might be, is my philosophy teacher-centered or is it student-centered? So thinking about relationships ruling, one of the things, regardless of what situation we end up in, we want to think about creating classroom community. So to create a classroom that has a focus on building a community with my current teaching situation or whatever educational system, if I'm a para or a spec ed teacher, whatever I am, and is it an ongoing focus of my teaching? And so one of the things I usually try to consider is to teach and interact with brain and developmental needs of my students and mine. That's part of a key part of bringing about a sense of community and belonging, because we know if there's fear, frustration, self-doubt, any kind of negative feeling, the brain's going to shut down. And no matter what else we come up with, learning isn't going to happen, because the brain is the learning organ, and it has those multiple points of access and multiple points of entry and multiple points of retention. And we want to keep that in mind as we're deciding. So the key to building community and positive emotion is important if we're going to be thinking about learning. One of my favorite mantras for many years, and I've been in education for 46 plus years, is emotion drives attention and attention drives learning. So by building community and thinking about our philosophy, those are two beginning points of thinking about keying into the students' emotions. So what are some tips that I can share with you that might help you with creating community? Well, one might be creating multiple student connections, being sure that you value and honor them. To create a variety of getting to know you class activities, most of us did that in the beginning of the year anyway, to get to know our students. To create interaction among students and others, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but that's so important if you're doing digital or even pickup education, to try to provide that. To create social gatherings for students and parents, and I mean not together, but COVID style and online digitally, there are ways to do that, and you'll want to examine your learning management system to see how that can be done, because we may even want to create both synchronous and asynchronous social gathering and sharing for our students. And to create themed live virtual events to build school spirit. Kids are used to those and they love those days, and we might be able to continue that digitally. So tips to create community. Ed Week, I read that actually this week that teens were surveyed and that many are depressed, and 40% say they had not been offered any social or emotional support by an adult from their school last year. Think about that. So this is a key to teens, but it's still important for our elementary students too, and our middle school students. We want to think about what are we doing to support them socially and emotionally. That's part of our community building. So you as the adult in the room, so to speak, what you might consider is, how are you going to create a compelling first impression? How are you going to create multiple ways for students to get to know you? And it's really okay if you're digital to have the baby on the shoulder or the dog scratching at your feet, you know, those things that make you personalized and human, because that's much harder on a screen than it is when you get that face-to-face time. And even if you get some face-to-face time, don't stop there with that. Continue to let them get to know you. How might you create ways and times to make yourself available? They need to know that. And that doesn't mean 24/7, by the way. You don't have to be available 24/7. You may have to adhere to school guidelines, but make sure the kids know that you're ready and willing and happy to meet with them. And last year we saw wonderful pictures, and you don't have to go do this, but of teachers showing up and using their car side as a whiteboard, or using the screen door or the storm door between them and the kids as a bulletin board. So there's lots of creative ways. That's why I built that into the philosophy thinking. How can you be creative and ingenious and still hold true to what you can do and what your philosophy is? And maybe creating opportunities to meet students in real time. And that doesn't mean face-to-face necessarily, but that you have that face-to-face time that maybe centers on them, where you're working with a small group, just getting to know them, or you connect with a student, just getting to know that student. And of course, that's different for elementary than it is perhaps middle and high school. And those folks may just need to do that and really focus on that with your most needy students that you know aren't getting much support. And then creating a communication plan for students and their parents. This is really key. I know parents that I listened to were particularly frustrated when they didn't have any idea how to communicate with the teacher and then get a fairly quick response. And I don't mean 12 hours, but certainly within a week. And I heard that from some parents, that they just felt like they would put out questions or try to seek that teacher, and that didn't necessarily get them a response that was timely. So I'm going to jump back into community thinking here for a minute. So you want to be able to think about building a capacity for students to be able to relate to their group, just like you probably did in your classroom face-to-face, that begins to build a trusting and safe environment. Work on those social emotional needs. Again, that's brain stuff. It helps the brain be ready to learn. And help kids feel as though they can develop relationships with their teachers besides you, and peers, and express themselves individually. Think about fostering an environment that promotes interactivity and participation, dialogue, and reciprocity. And I'm going to get into some of that when I talk about pedagogy in just a few minutes. And then you want to be sure you're monitoring anything that the students are doing, any particular situation that they're grouped in. You want to make sure it's on target. You want to make sure that everybody's kind and careful with each other. So the other thing we always did at the beginning of the year, and it's no less important digitally or in a blended situation, is we want to invest time spent on procedures and routines. And that helps students feel safe. It lets everybody know what they're supposed to do. And even the youngest students can be part of developing those procedures and routines. You can have your non-negotiables, we have to, but you can allow students the time and opportunity to give input, and that gives them some voice and ownership in your community. This is also a perfect time to teach your students and have them practice how it is to be an online group, because later you may want them to do that with some content and some academia. And so this is a time where you can teach and practice that, where there's not the investment of grades and assessment connected to it, and how to share as a whole group. You don't assume kids know that. You may have to teach how to do that. And so this will be valuable as your community learns to work and collaborate together and trust how they're sharing is valued and respected. Again, don't assume they know how. You may have to teach it. And so these are components that you teach and you practice. You may want to establish your expectations for behavior in your blended and online classroom. There are things that are just, again, non-negotiable, but maybe you can talk about as a group that's going to work together. How are we going to do that? How are we going to live together online? How are we going to live together when we get to see each other, the 5 or 6 of us in a classroom at a time? So the other thing to think about is those non-negotiables. Yeah, we need sort of a hard line, but be ready to be flexible to the situation and the student. And here's another thing I read in my research that sort of struck me. Don't assume that all your students can communicate or understand with clarity and meaning when it happens online. We think of them being so tech savvy because they game and they do other things online, but don't assume that they automatically can transfer that thinking and that understanding to an academic situation. So again, as part of building your community, and maybe this goes back to your philosophy, you may need to be willing to dig deeper into responses and try to make sure kids understand how to be clear and make meaning. And you can do that within that community building. So I want to go into relationships rule and this big word that shows up everywhere. I teach at the university level. It shows up in letters to us as university instructors. I hear it from teachers, I hear it from parents, and I hear it from kids. We need to be empathetic. So we want to create and build student relationships that have a focus on empathy. And I'm saying we need to. There's very few times I'm going to say we need to, but I really feel so strongly about this. This will be an ongoing focus of my teaching decision making. I think that's just really important. Just using these pictures as examples, there you see a student who's really frustrated, just butting into her pencil like, I've just had it. And then you see on the other side, these 2 little kiddos hugging. They're not going to get to do that anymore at school. Those littles in the playground and the middle school kids who fuss with each other down the hall and the high schoolers who do what they do in the hallway, those things aren't going to be happening anymore. And so when we think about that, that's really very isolating for them. And we even have students like the little girl sitting out in the meadow who are still totally isolated. Some students may already be hanging out together because of the way their parents have chosen to deal with this at this point. And we know friendships naturally change, but we have kids who feel very lonely and very isolated, and they may be looking out their living room window and seeing their friends playing, and their parents aren't letting them yet. And it's not about right and wrong. It's just about how different families are dealing with this situation and their own home situation and how they're going to be with their children. So I think that's a key to being mindful to empathy. And then next, I think I'd like to share some tips for you. It seems like an easy thing to do, but I'd really like to think about as we transition to online instruction. For me, as an instructor, I was college online, but I felt very uncertain. I felt confused at times. I had some self-doubt. Can I really show community and empathy and be that instructor online that they don't really, that my folks don't see me. And as I switched over to that, I had to really think about how am I going to show this and still hold the line of being an instructor who's focused on content also. So here's some tips you might think about, and I have them listed here. And by the way, I am going to have handouts posted that have these on them, so you can go in and access those. Josh will post them on the Region 8 website and also on our Makerspace Weebly website. So don't worry about writing and copying and things. These are things that will be available to you. So things to consider is, do all my students have support at home? Because there's sort of this assumption that there's a parent sitting there with them all the time they're working, and maybe that parent's working or isn't available because there's 3 other kids at home. And what kind of support are they getting? Maybe the parent isn't as well educated and is struggling, especially if you have middle and high school students and you're talking math or chemistry and some of these high level content areas. Don't assume that parent can be the tutor. That may not necessarily be so. And that doesn't mean lack of support. It means tutoring, educational support. What are the literacy and other demands for my content area? We tend, especially at the upper levels, to get a little complacent because we love our content and we're really working with it, but we forget we have other demands that kids need to have. You know, are they literacy proficient for my content area? Do they have the background knowledge for what I'm going to teach? And this also plays down into elementary too. But it's easier for us to pick it up at elementary because we're multi-content oriented, where at the secondary level, we're focused on our main content. And then another one, C, should I reconsider my expectations for accountability? And I addressed some assessment coming up here, but that's really, I'm hearing from instructors that was really a big thing. If I have kids working with their parents, or they don't have that support time, and they're not performing as well, how am I holding them accountable? Or what if the kids don't come on and see me when they're supposed to? How am I holding them accountable? How am I keeping that going? And it's easy to get caught up in, you're gonna do this, but think about it with some grace and empathy for those children too. So that brings us to the right-hand column. I'm thinking about what avenues can I create to understand what my students are dealing with? What can I do to support my students' social and emotional needs? And how can I build strong relationships with my students? One that demonstrates empathy. And remember, you may be their key individual that they connect with as an adult outside of their home. They may not be seeing grandparents and aunts and uncles and other adults. It may just be their bubble family, and they're really missing that connection with another adult who cares for them. And so showing that empathy also shows love and care, and that's really important. And that sense of isolation that some of those kids are going to have, I feel it intensely as an adult. Kids can't filter those intense feelings quite as easily because there's no handbook on how to deal with this. And there's no even handbook that's clearly how to do blended online learning during a pandemic when you don't have all your students at one time. So handling that with empathy. And I think the other thing is to think about dealing with ourselves with empathy too. Be kind to yourself, be gracious to yourself, give yourself some space to work through this and make mistakes, and be honest with your students about that. If you show them empathy and then you show yourself empathy, that again goes back to that community I was talking about, where you're building that sense of we're all in this together. And one more thing I wanted to bring about thinking about with empathy, and I just thought of this, these continued changes, especially going back to school for kids, it's not going to be what they're used to unless you are sending a kindergartner off, everybody else being school. And so school being different, 5 or 6 kids in a classroom, you can't go out on the playground, you can't eat with your friends, there's no gym, music, band, whatever. That may reignite some grief and some sadness. And these can be very strong feelings. And again, with empathy, we can help those kids work through that and deal with that and be honestly working on it. So as we proceed further, Now we're starting to play into the thinking of culture. Climate and community describes that shared perception of the class. Culture includes how students feel about the classroom and the beliefs and the values and the assumptions they have that provides their identity within that classroom and sets the standards of behavior for the class. And so this is what helps build that positive climate and that positive community. So we want to create a culture that respects diversity and all our learners and is student-centered in its learning and with our learning and is student-owned. So students don't show up to our online classes with name tags that shares the difficulties they're facing during the pandemic. Again, families have adapted in different ways, and this can create those social emotional needs I was talking about. And some children may even have parents that are now unemployed, and their standard of living has changed, and their home culture has changed. So building that culture within our classroom that gives them that sense of safety and security and identity is really important. And that kind of goes back to rethinking that philosophy. Perhaps that wasn't the most important thing before, and perhaps now you think, maybe I need to work that in and put that in there so that I know I'm working on that. And so a huge part of building that culture goes back to empathy. Many of us as teachers buy into this empathetic practice, and we may accomplish this by listening carefully to our students, and we look at how they're doing with their work and their accountability. But during online learning, we may need to create intentional avenues for students to share and listen carefully so that we can see their perspectives and respond accordingly. And that may give us that time, as I mentioned before, to get in real time with those students. During online learning, those intentional avenues also will build opportunities for us to help their classmates see how to do this too. We may create avenues for them to communicate and build that culture together in an online way. So we want to work on that culture and our climate and our community and our empathy with our students. In continuing thinking about creating a classroom culture, I put some slides up or some pictures on the slide to kind of get us moving just a little further and thinking that part of building our culture is to help students understand they're going to be learning some really valuable strategies and skills to be successful. It may be us working on helping them with self-pacing, time management, planning, reflection on their work and progress. And it may be that we think about their input and some key character traits that we still want to teach about and be honored. Part of our culture is to build a culture of questioning. If you look at the girl with all the question marks, we want our kids just constantly questioning. And then we have a young man who is thinking, oh, do I want to be an astronaut? Do I want to be an engineer? Do I want to be a teacher? What do I want to be? Because that culture of questioning and culture of thinking brings about those kinds of things. And we want kids, even at the youngest age, to know and think, gosh, I could be this. And this is why what I'm doing is important. And the design process I put on there because that can be adapted. That's our STEM and our makers process, but it can be adapted to anything that you do to think about how do I think about my thinking? How do I work through a problem or an issue? Do I need to go back and tweak it? What if I fail? Then what do I do? Where do I go back to? It's circular. And then do I try it again? And so that thinking, that culture of thinking, that culture of trying, that's what we want to be thinking about assisting. And we want to think it can be very private for some kids. It can be very personalized, but we're really all the time working toward the future. When we talk with business people, they want kids who think and question and are innovative and design thinking, and we can build that into every content area that we teach. We want to try to do a lot of this during our FaceTime if we get that, because that sets the tone for our learning. And it also sets the tone for absence of threat. And again, that helps the brain go into that learning mode. And if we have that culture of support and safety and empathy, then those new skills that we're training, even those character skills that we're training, will become part of the daily thinking in our students and a part of our daily work with them. So when we pick those key character traits to build, that's also how we respond to kids. One of my epiphany moments with an instructor was one said, don't say, I like how so-and-so's thinking about, or I like how so-and-so's doing this. What if that kid doesn't care about what I think that day? It's better to target your verbiage and to say, I notice Sarah's thinking because this is how she's responding to me, or I notice so-and-so heard they were supposed to be active listening because they're looking at me. And so instead of I like, I notice, because that's what business people are doing. They're noticing. They're noticing what you're doing. And sometimes you don't care what your boss likes. You want your boss to notice what you're doing. So again, we're preparing them for that college and career, for our target talk. In our content areas too, elementary all the way up, we want to honor the diversity of our students. We'll have our ELL students. We're going to have special ed students. And if you're not sure how to work with them, the culture is you're going to find out. How do I do this online? There's research that can be done. I would go to the people that you know in your school district that can help you with this. That's what they're working on over the summer, how to help you deliver appropriate instruction and how to empower your students. So now we have some time for discussion and comments, and I would invite Cindy. She's sort of my heads up person, and she's the one that brings me back to my thinking. So Cindy, do you have anything you want to share or have me share at this point?
Well, I think to start out with the idea of creating an updated philosophy really makes a lot of sense. Our teachers are really having to redesign this airplane while they're in flight. And so it has created tons of pressure on them. And many of them are probably thinking that, their job is to create an online experience that would be the same as what kids would get in the classroom. And so they're trying to do for students online what they would normally do in the classroom. And it's hard if your normal way of building relationships with kids, particularly I'm thinking of the secondary level, a lot of times it's just to have joking conversations with them, side talks, and joke around in the classroom. And that's kind of a common relationship building technique for a lot of our secondary teachers. But when it comes to online kinds of things, these are individual conversations they might have with kids in the hallway, or they might get to know them as a coach, or in a very informal way, and that's how they build a relationship. So how do our secondary people who maybe aren't used to a lot of these community circle type activities that maybe are ingrained in elementary, how can they reach out to create these relationships, which we know is so important for the learning to occur?
I think part of it is if you get a blended situation, that especially in the beginning of the year where they might have just gone right into syllabus and right into, here's your novel or here's your assignment. Now I think they have to do some focusing on that community building, because they're not going to get a whole class at a time. This isn't going to be 28 kids showing up. This may be 5 or 6 or 10 if you're lucky. Mm-hmm. So I think that focus in the beginning of the year of building the relationship, building the community, and building the culture will ultimately play out. And here's how it's going to play out: student engagement. If the kids don't feel connected to you, they don't have to show up online. I mean, you can't go to their home and force them to open that computer. The only thing you have for accountability with those upper level kids is grades. And so, yeah, we have kids that are going to play by the rules, and they're going to be online every time, and they're going to be engaged every time because that's what they do. They're compliant. But compliant doesn't necessarily mean heart invested. Mm-hmm. And so the place to focus in the beginning when you get them, or you can do it online through Zoom work, whatever, really invest that first week or two on building those relationships. Relationships rule. That's why I made that the title. They just do. And our teenagers, many of our teens, you see teens out on the street hanging out together, but a lot of teens aren't yet. They don't have interaction with other teens other than through Zoom, and they're texting in their normal digital avenues, but they're not having time to really delve into things that are important to them. And so I like to think of it kind of what we do in advisory in some high schools, where you really are working on that, building a community. So yeah, you may still have 150 students in 4 preps, but if you take that time in the beginning of the year and really work at that in all the different ways and avenues you have, FaceTime, blended, Zoom, one-to-one. If you're looking at 2 or 3 of your secondary kids and they're sitting like this the whole time, then that's a kid to go make some personal contact with, whether it's a phone call or a quick FaceTime, something where you're getting, were you okay today? You know, I was sensing you weren't with me. Can you tell me more about that? You know, just asking those key questions to show you care. It's kind of like in the beginning of the year, we stand in the hall, we high five those kids, we stand at our door, we greet them. Oh, neat new hairdo, I love your outfit. We're not going to do that. So now we've got to do that in a different way. And so it's no less important for those secondary kids, and in some ways it's more important because they're pulling away from their parents and more invested in their peers. And that's the other thing we can do for them, is give them that peer connection time. Of course, they'll probably have it with their little group of friends, but many kids thrived in that big hallway time and talking and meeting and having fun and goofing around, and they aren't going to have that anymore. So we have to take what they had, and we can't reconstruct it, but we can put something else in the place of it. Does that kind of deal?
Yeah, I'm excited to hear more about these intentional avenues that you're teasing us with. So,
well, I think I'm headed into engagement here pretty quick. So let's go ahead forward. Did that clear whatever you had thinking going, Cindy? Did that take care of it? Did you have anything else? Oh, she's muted. So on with engagement. So relationships rule, and that's a key part of creating engagement, to create classroom activities that are focused on how the brain works and retains information, remembering that emotion drives attention, attention drives learning. And to go back to what Cindy was just talking to me about, if I have an emotional connection with my kids and they're emotionally invested in the classroom and with each other, and then hopefully the content that I probably love for sure, then that's going to drive their learning. And that's how we can approach our thinking in getting kids to engage. And so what I'd like to do is give you some tips to think about that. And again, I'll have handouts so that you can work through some of this when you have more time to think. So you might think of these teaching decisions. Can I create situations that fit this evolving school situation? Can I involve student engagement with content and each other and me? And how am I going to do that? Do I focus on students owning the learning? Do I give them voice and choice? That gives them emotional engagement and it gives them a sense of ownership. What about personalizing the learning and engagement with a wide range of activities that offer voice and choice? And project-based learning and some of these other avenues of engagement really are good for this kind of thinking. How about using my tech tools to align my standards and curriculum? How am I doing that? Because we don't want it to be about being techno-savvy per se. We want the tech to be the tool to engage students in authentic learning. And that's what we might want to be keeping in mind. So we're integrating that learning with authentic experiences, and that's where our STEM and STEAM activities can come in. We have Makerspace here at Region 8, and we teach teachers how to get kids actively involved in STEM and STEAM activities, but we also can involve literature and English language arts and other kinds of music and art and all kinds of content areas, business, in with this. So you might think about that kind of integration. And then again, whether we're doing kindergarten, this isn't the heavy emphasis, but as we go up through the grade levels, how does what we're doing and engaging them in relate to college and career? Because the big thing kids ask is, what do I have to learn this for? You know, and you really don't want them asking that. You should be talking about colleges and careers and plans and, oh gosh, you know, you might go to a trade school to learn how to do this, and this could be a really neat thing. I see you have an interest in this. We can be promoting that thinking. So we're looking at using blended and self-paced work and giving kids an opportunity to manage their time. Kids in school prior to this didn't get to manage time. We managed their time for them. At 40 minutes, off went the bell. Or a teacher in an elementary said, okay, it's 9:35, we're going to gym. You know, they didn't have time to manage. And if you never get time to manage, you don't learn how to manage it. So that's a skill we can give them. That's a valuable college and career readiness kind of skill, as well as a good skill while they're in school with us. We can think about using our 21st century skills of being creative and critically thinking and building that into engagement and getting them deep diving into their content. Again, PBL is one of those things that helps us do that. We may find that a great deal of the time we're more of a facilitator than a knowledge imparter. Students, we want to give them enough background and information that they then can work with that information and their questions, not just be consumers. So we may need also to engage students to individualize more to meet our student needs. And this could also include our ELL students and our special ed students. We may have to be more mindful of that. And as we move on in our thinking, here's some other tips to create some engagement. So we might meet student needs by providing learning that involves collaborative and synchronous interaction with teachers and their classmates. We might provide interactivity that includes games and web-based situations, interactive videos, real-world views and connections. And I want to go back to the gaming because Robert Marzano, who's a wonderful education researcher guru, says games and the emotional connection we make to games is one of the ways we get the brains to delve into long-term memory and bring back information later. So games are really an important part of your decision making. And then opportunities to be challenged via our projects and activities that address real world challenges. And you know, your kids are coming back to school and the world's full of challenges right now and things you could have them deal with no matter their grade level. You just have to make it appropriate to where they are in your content area as well as their developmental aspects. So if we're thinking about relationships ruling moving on, that's going to also mean we have to think about new pedagogy. As Cindy mentioned, you know, we're not going to be teaching the way we've been teaching because we're in a new and different situation. So we want to think about how do we create and adapt pedagogy, staying focused on student-centered learning and activities. And I'm a John Dewey fan, and I love this, and I kept it in mind during my teaching life with students. If we teach today's students as we taught yesterday's, we rob them of tomorrow. And this is really important right now, because we can't teach today, coming up this fall, the way we taught 2 years ago. It's not going to work. And we'll frustrate ourselves, and more importantly, we'll frustrate our students. You know, if we look at our student with a mask, if we look at our student, you know, high-fiving through the computer, all those different situations, they've never had to deal with that, and neither have we. So I want to continue with thinking about some things to consider as we're still working through this pedagogy. Again, student-centered, again, authentic work, again, voice and choice, again, learning skills and strategies that are focused and that tech is taught. Don't assume the kids know how to use the tech in your learning management system. Don't assume they remember from last spring. Teach them how to use it. Give them practice before you expect them to apply it. Be sure digital citizenship, can't say that fast, is in place, and that you have adequate, appropriate use policies in place. You don't want to get caught in that and put yourself at risk. So you need to make sure it's clear and it's referred to continually. And hopefully your school may have those things in place, but if they don't, you need to. You want those students to be centered on their learning. I keep saying that, I can't emphasize it enough. Make sure that your work is authentic, and when you're switching to that more online format, the focus is can be often substituting that traditional material for digital ones, like just putting worksheets and things online, and that has its place. But you may want to also consider other things that you can do to enhance that learning and get that engagement going as part of your pedagogy. So you want to work on incorporating those digital enhancements like comments, hyperlinks, working with multimedia. So your content may stay the same, but students can now use these digital features to enhance the lesson. Having them create portfolios or things like live binders for presentations, and also for you to be able to assess them. And again, gamifying how you assess with quizzes like Socrative and Kahoot, those kinds of easy to access kinds of things. When you move on to your tech integration, for some of you it may be new. Your school and district may be just now getting one-to-one this year. The kids are getting their computers for the first time over the summer. Some districts, this is old hat. They've been e-learning for years. Others, not so much. So where your lessons are modified via your learning management system, this is going to open up new channels of communication that might have been more marginalized for your students prior to 2020. So think of the back channels and alternative conversations that can run alongside your synchronous instruction and put those to good use. And so this is a way that you can instruct and encourage more participation. And for some kids, they really like that back channel, that back chat, because it's safer than raising your hand and speaking out in class. Because if somebody makes a comment, that you can address it and make it a positive comment. If it's one of those we've all had, I'm like, oh, where'd that come from? We can turn it into that positive thing. And don't forget, you have features like Zoom and other kinds of things you can use to get those kids together. So redefining this transformative learning enables a teacher to do activities that really were impossible in that face-to-face classroom. So you've got some opportunity to really be creative and move the kids forward in a way that you couldn't before. Students can access people and places and ideas from all over the world. That's very exciting, no matter what your content area is. They can write their own wiki or blogs, and they can do like quad blogging. So there's other kinds of ways they can communicate that'll open up all kinds of avenues of learning. So you want to think about this being incorporated into thinking and engagement. And again, you're tying it back all the time to where are we going with this? And especially for your secondary kids, you can be doing that college career readiness talk. It's not having a class in college and career readiness. We're talking about it all the time. Just like we talk diversity thinking all the time and character traits all the time. It's not a class. It's a way of thinking about future and how kids are going to progress toward that, so that when they get to be older and that junior and senior year, they're not all of a sudden going, oh, I never heard college and career. What am I doing? I don't know what I'm doing. You don't want that to happen. You're putting that in place all the way along. So as we continue with online pedagogy, here's just some things about thinking about the capabilities of your students and the technology in your current teaching situation. How can my lesson be improved using the technology that's available to me? That will vary among you. What are the ways I can engage and empower students through the use of technology? How can I create learning that resembles authentic and real-world learning and meeting real-world needs when I can't do face-to-face? And then here's some of the bottom line for some of you. That frustration, broken pencil could be some teachers, because you really want to make sure that your plans and software are reliable. And do you have adequate support if you have that kind of a tech problem? You want to be sure you know where to go. And the other thing to build in with your students, and this is really key for elementary folks, make sure your kids are reasonably computer board proficient. We know with our UDL kids, we might have speech to text kind of things and closed caption and all that, but kids that are struggling to type and or work on a Chromebook, they're going to struggle, and an average assignment's going to take a long time. We want to be sure the kids are very clear on how to access and use their learning management system. We want to prepare asynchronous helpers for tech issues, so there's a way for kids to get that information to problem solve. I use Canvas at my university level, and if I run into a situation I don't know how to deal with, I've got a big resource to work through that before I ever have to contact an individual. So you also want to share with your kids how to get tech help, so you don't have to be available 24/7. And again, make sure you have digital citizenship and appropriate use policy in place so you don't get caught. As we move forward and thinking about more about online technology, I want to get into thinking about some things I know teachers ran into. And this came out of me listening to everything from a classroom instructor to a para to spec ed. What are your barriers to your current teaching situation as you move forward? And are your plans that you're making suitable and the technology you and your students have available, is that going to work? Is what you're doing going to be sustainable for the long term? Because frankly, most of us don't want to put all summer into something that in another year we can't use or isn't usable. And so think long term, not just for a year, so that that plan can be sustained. And so remember, technology shouldn't be the focus. Learning is to be the focus. So online pedagogy, I wanted to just bring this in again, just those pedagogical structures. So direct instruction, those sample models still work. Lectures and demonstration, they still work. Models like the Pearson model, I do, we do, then you do, still works. The workshop model, you do a mini lesson, you practice together, you have group meetings, and they go work, and then you share a link. Excuse me, I have to take a drink. We want to continue to think about Bloom's and Webb's depth of knowledge. Josh, I've got to pause.
Take your time, Chris. We'll edit this part out. Don't worry. Are you okay?
Can I go back to the beginning of this slide?
Yeah, we can just start the slide over.
Yeah, just a second. Let me take one more step. I'm sorry. I thought I was going to get through it.
Take your time. Just make a note of where we're at.
Okay, I think I'm ready. Let's try again.
Okay.
I'm going to go back to the beginning.
We'll just take a pause. We'll take a pause real quick just so I can see the audio go flat, and then just go ahead and start on this slide. Is that okay?
Okay.
Okay, and we're about 50 minutes in so far. Just Jane's noting. I don't know where we're at in the flow here. So just so you know.
I
All right.
timed it that we 40 minutes or so.
Okay.
So
I'm sorry about that. Just we'll do a quick pause and then you'll be back on. Okay, okay, Chris.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about that online pedagogy because a lot of the pedagogy that we were using is still good. Best practice is best practice. So if we think about direct instruction models, we still can lecture and do direct teaching and demonstrations. We still can do models like the Pearson model where I do, we do, you do, and then we come back online and share. Or we do, you do, offline. The workshop model still works. We can do our mini lesson, we can do practice time, I can do group meetings, we can go work, and then we can share. So these models that we've used still work. Our cognitive practice, our sample models, Bloom's taxonomy, still best practice. Webb's depth of knowledge, still best practice. There are structured activities that include our reasoning, inductive reasoning, open-ended questions, visible learning, metacognitive strategies, those all still are best practice. Just because we have to do pedagogy in a different way online doesn't mean our best practice pedagogies aren't still applicable. And then our social models that we've always used, that online collaborative instructional methods, that's still good stuff. You may have to be creative and inventive with how to do collaboration, and some of those even Kagan models like Jigsaw and some of those, you can still do that. You just have to rethink how it's going to be done. We can still do reciprocal teaching and Socratic seminars, small group case studies, fish bowls, gallery walks. We just have to be creative in how that's going to happen. But those pedagogies we've been using are still applicable, and we don't want to put the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. So I want to think about assessments and feedback, because we can't think through all this without getting down to that nitty gritty. We have to be able to assess both informative and summative assessment. So we want to create and adapt assessments and feedbacks and reflections to truly reflect student-centered learning and growth. And these tools can be used to assist students with setting short and long-term goals. That hasn't changed and won't change. If we take a look at Dewey again, moving forward, when we learn from experience, but we have to reflect on that experience for it to mean something. So our big issue with retooling education last year was thinking about accountability and grades, because remember, this was baptism by fire. We hadn't had any time to think about it, but that's something you really want to consider, because our students didn't choose the situation that they're in, and they shouldn't be penalized for the challenges it presents when they're learning from home, especially. And so there's a debate still among educators, and you may be experiencing that within your own school and district, about the extent to balance empathy and generosity with the high standards in our grading and our assessment practices. And that's something you need to work through. And you, in the secondary level, that may be even a team decision in your department. But this doesn't seem to be the time to up and tighten up our expectations about student participation, because sometimes they don't have control over that. We don't want to be irritated along with parents who are upset about their kids' lack of engagement. So we don't want to have parents and us against the kid and put that kid in a corner. That's not going to work either. So we have to be careful about that. And we certainly don't ever want to criticize our colleagues and what they're choosing to do. So we want to focus on being a team with our parent, ourselves, with the students, to solve situations and realize that expectations are being met. That's always been true. And the bottom line is, with assessment, kids need to know how they're doing, how to improve, how to move forward, and that needs to be communicated to their parents as stakeholders. So when we get into grading, we're not going to know how much the parents are involved and how much that work is truly that students. It's like the old science fair thing. Great science fair project, you know, it looks like the parents spent all night doing it. We need to be very careful when we're assessing that we're really taking the opportunity to assess the kids and what they know. And that may have to happen in real time online, as opposed to an assignment that you've given for them to complete and then turn in. So then, do your students and families know consistently how they're doing per grades? Make sure you're keeping up so that the kids know if they're growing and they can reflect on that. What's the evidence of learning? And then, are some of your e-learning assignments more important than others? Can you just give points for completion for some of them? How many grades do you need to adequately assess? 36 or 1 per week? You know, think about how many you need and how many you need to produce. How are you going to ensure confidentiality of how the kids are doing? And that's something you have to take up with your school and your team. What kind of penalties are you going to put in place for not doing work? How are you going to have work revised and get better? What is going to be your technique for that? And what are the implications for your grading with blended and e-learning? How's that all going to come together? So you need to be sure that parents and students clearly know your expectations regarding grading. It's very frustrating if that doesn't happen. Do they have a clear vision of what a successful performance is? And this is where rubrics come in, and you share rubrics and you share your expectations and criteria before it starts, not at the end. Kids still need to know what that target performance is, and oftentimes they need a model to see what it's going to be like. Are you thinking about evaluating processes as well as products for those longer term assignments? So do your grades adequately assess and report learning? So I'm getting down to some nitty gritty here. If we think about relationships rule, we know some difficulties happen. And I wanted to phrase it in how creating solutions, because in teaching, we've always had barriers and we've always had issues and problems. But now they can be more pronounced because we're in such an unusual situation that we weren't trained to deal with, and we're doing it on the fly a lot of the time. So we want to create solutions to determine barriers to successful integration and learning for blended and e-learning. So perhaps with your team, or even on your own, or with an administrator, to have those conversations about what those barriers were, that they're adequately identified, because you can't work with nebulous stuff. And maybe that's not just a once a year thing to do. Maybe what you do is you have that before school starts, and then you go on throughout the year and have key points where you're going to come back together and see if there's new barriers. So what are the important issues from last year that need solving for you to have smooth tech integration or pickup? The pickup thing can be a big muddle too. So if you had to have students come and pick stuff up and take it home and do, and then bring it back and deliver it, you know, you've got a whole way that that has to happen. So how can that be smoother if it wasn't smooth? How can you know what the most important issues are? How are you going to figure that out? Is it just what you think, or are you going to do some surveying and some assessing from your stakeholders? Can you anticipate some barriers and how these can be overcome before they happen? Can you enlist a support team to help problem solve issues that infringe on student successful learning? Many corporations, especially when it comes to technology, have a technology department, and that's certainly who you want to work with. But sometimes those issues are how you're implementing pedagogy and student engagement into the technology that you have that's really out of their realm. So that's where working with your team or your department or your administrator comes into play. And so as we continue thinking about solutions, we need to think about, in my mind, so here are some of the top barriers that I've seen in my research that seem to inhibit online learners and their engagement, and see if any of these resonate with you. And the pictures sure did to me, because I've seen my own grandkids. My daughter sent me photographs. That could have been them. It's not, but it could have been them. So you want to kind of try to keep that from happening. So are you dealing with those social emotional issues, and was there a barrier to that? How about struggling with adapting to this new learning? What about lack of engagement when they're online, or just getting them online? What about they're inhibited because they lack tech experience? What if they had previous tech experience that was negative, and now they've got that mind block? I can't do this. I don't, you know, I'm not intuitive. I don't know how to do this. There's lack of self-motivation. There's online learner boredom. We heard it. All of us heard it. May came, and the word was, I'm done as the parent, and my kids are done. Done, done, done. So how do we keep that from happening? Because that is a barrier. We may have to be going to school at all kinds of weird times. We may go to school through the summer. We may have alternate ways we deal with kids. We don't know. And so if that's a barrier, how are we going to deal with that? How do we deal with the barrier of lack of support at home, not from us, but at the home situation? And then how do we help them deal with the barrier of time management issues, of getting work done and on time? And so we really need to focus on some of those things that we see occurring regularly throughout research and what we hear, and get that taken care of. So that brings us to then, it's always important in our relationship to create those family relationships, whether we're elementary, middle school, high school. And we can create them online through creating that portfolio or binder of ways for our parents to access information and know what's going on and be able to communicate with us. We want to be sure that they know that they can get a hold of us one-to-one. We may have a parent night that's a Zoom meeting. We might want to do something as simple as sending home a postcard to some of our kids, especially those we know are struggling, that just says, hey, great job this week online. Just those simple communicative techniques. Again, that goes back to culture and community and empathy and philosophy. So no matter what age our kids are that we're dealing with, whether they're kindergartners or 12th graders, the essentials still need to be communicated. How to communicate with you, when the assessments are, how they're being graded, what grades are, how you're going to communicate student needs that parents can work on with you as a team. And it needs to be an easy to locate location online. We need to be able to get information from our parents. I highly suggest a survey of some kind to get information from parents about what were the things that worked and what were some barriers they faced. So as you go through some problem solving, you can deal with that. Even at the secondary level, that weekly newsletter that can go out, you know, you type it up, it can be kind of blog style, couple paragraphs, send it out email. just to keep communicating with parents. Sure enjoyed being with the kids this week. This is a new situation. We're going to be Zooming 3 times next week, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, whatever. Keep that information going. And then again, having times where you might invite parents to be with you and be with their students in some kind of synchronous celebration or back to school night or something like that can go a long way toward building that spirit and community. So if we go to the end of our thinking today, after viewing this webinar, do you think you're going to make any adjustments or changes or additions to your original thinking about your philosophy? Are you going to share that with your stakeholders? And have you changed your thinking in community building and empathy and culture, engagement, pedagogy? Is there anything that you're going to do that might be different or enhanced? So I want to thank you so much for listening, and I'm going to give Cindy a chance to comment or ask some questions, and we'll be done. So Cindy, anything from you?
I don't think I have any questions. I just think, again, the idea that, if you go into this as the teacher, that this is a barrier for you, that this is going to be a struggle for you, then it will look like that to your students. But if you go into this new way of teaching with some excitement and maybe a rejuvenation, maybe you look at this as an opportunity to reset and do some things that you've never thought you could do before or you've never tried before. Do them now. Your attitude and your approach to this will be what your students follow. So I would encourage you all to really invest in that philosophy recommendation that Chris made. So thanks again for all of your suggestions today, Chris. I think they've been very helpful.
And I want to remind that there'll be handouts so that all that stuff, if you want to access it for your own reflection, and I highly recommend you spend a lot of time reflecting, as I know you already are, that's there for you to think about.
Right.
Thank you so much, Chris, for a lot of great information there for our folks to digest. And what's great about this format is obviously you can go back, you can pause, reflect, go back and replay a section if you want to kind of rethink about what was discussed today. I want to thank Cindy McKinney for leading our discussion sections today and collaborating with us on this. We have several folks offline as well who've been collaborators who are part of our Makerspace and Ask teams. And so I want to thank from our Ask team, Steve Debker and Barb Cisco, and from our Makerspace teams, Mike Gorman, Jane Gorman, and Laura Smith, who are also with us today off screen, helping to support putting this together. Again, I want to thank the Schwab Foundation for their continued support of these both of these initiatives. Without them, we would not be able to bring this to you today. More information on this topic and other great topics can be found at the website listed there on your screen right now, indianamakerspace.weebly.com. This video and supporting materials will be posted there, as well as on the Region 8 website. We invite you to check that out. And you also see Chris's email address. If you have any questions, want to reach out to her, more clarification on things that were discussed today, we invite you to do that. Thank you so much for joining us today on our learning series that we are happy to bring to you. Again, hope you are doing well and hope to see you next time. Have a great day.